The Deadliest. Radioactive Places on Earth. Part 4.
The city of Goiânia in central Brazil became the site of one of the world's worst radiological accidents in 1987, leaving behind abandoned homes and contaminated land. Unlike nuclear test ranges or military facilities, the contamination came from a medical device, showing how radioactive material can create disaster even far from reactors or weapons programs. The event began when two men scavenged an abandoned cancer treatment clinic. The clinic contained a teletherapy machine with a highly radioactive cesium-137 source used for radiotherapy. The machine had been left behind when the clinic moved, unsecured and unmonitored. The scavengers dismantled it, removing a capsule that contained cesium chloride powder, a highly soluble and easily dispersible radioactive material. Unaware of its danger, they brought the capsule home, and over the next several days the glowing blue powder fascinated family, friends, and neighbors. Some people rubbed it on their skin, others sprinkled it on the ground, and children played with it. Soon residents began falling ill with symptoms of acute radiation sickness. Within weeks, 4 people had died and hundreds were contaminated. Once the source of the sickness was identified, authorities launched an emergency response. Entire houses were evacuated, belongings were destroyed, and large areas were cordoned off. Over 100,000 people were tested for contamination, with around 250 found to have significant internal or external exposure. The cleanup involved demolishing contaminated houses, scraping soil, and removing cars, furniture, and clothing. Much of this material was too contaminated to decontaminate safely, so it was buried as radioactive waste. Entire homes were reduced to rubble with contaminated debris sealing off in the concrete-lined drums for disposal, and to this day some fenced-off lots remain empty, never rebuilt due to lingering contamination fears. This accident highlighted the weaknesses of the regulatory oversight of radioactive sources. Unlike nuclear power plants or weapons sites, small-scale medical and industrial uses of radioactive material had received less attention. The fact that such a potent source was left unsecured in an abandoned clinic shows the risks of poor management. Today the city is thriving, but parts of it remained marked by the incident. Radioactive waste generated during cleanup was buried at a disposal facility about 20 kilometers away. This city shows that radioactive abandonment can happen anywhere, not just where nuclear programs are concentrated. The abandoned homes, the empty lots, and the waste storage areas remain among the most unusual radioactive sites in the world, tied not to war or power generation, but to an accident involving a forgotten medical machine. Number 4. The Navajo Nation uranium mines in the southwestern U.S. Across the deserts and plateaus of the Navajo Nation, in parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, are hundreds of abandoned uranium mines and mills. These sites are radioactive remnants of the uranium boom of the mid-20th century, when mining companies extracted uranium ore for nuclear weapons and energy programs. Decades later, abandoned mine shafts, tailing piles, and contaminated water sources continue to affect Navajo communities. Uranium mining began on Navajo land in the 1940s, spurred on by U.S. government demand for nuclear material. Over the next several decades, more than 500 mines were opened across the Navajo Nation, and workers, many of them Navajo men, dug ore from shafts and open pits with little protection. Safety standards were pretty minimal, and companies often failed to inform workers of any risk. By the 1980s, the demand for uranium declined and most mines closed, leaving behind contaminated landscapes. Some tailings piles eroded into the streams, which contaminated drinking water, and homes were built from materials taken from mine sites, which further spread the exposure. The health consequences for the Navajo communities have been severe. Studies have shown elevated rates of lung cancer, kidney disease, and other illnesses linked to uranium exposure. Generations of families were affected as workers carried dust home on their clothing, and children played near contaminated sites. Entire areas around the former mining towns are now dotted with abandoned structures and contaminated land. For example, near Church Rock, New Mexico, a 1979 dam failure released millions of gallons of radioactive slurry into the Puerco River, contaminating a huge region. The story of these mines isn't just about the industrial abandonment, it's about the environmental justice needed. Navajo communities bore the risks and health consequences of uranium mining without reaping its benefit. Today, the abandoned mines and contaminated land are reminders of that imbalance, a radioactive burden that was left behind for future generations. Number 3. Mailu Su, Kyrgyzstan. Mailu Su, a small city in southern Kyrgyzstan, is home to one of the most dangerous legacies in Central Asia. Unlike a high-profile nuclear accident zone, Mailu Su's contamination stems from uranium mining during the Soviet era. Uranium mining began here in the late 1940s when the Soviet Union sought raw materials for the nuclear weapons program. Over the next 2 decades, workers extracted and processed tens of thousands of tons of uranium ore. By the time the operation stopped in the 1960s, the area contained more than 20 tailings dumps and dozens of abandoned mine sites. The contamination around the area is widespread. Uranium decay products like radium-226 and thorium, as well as heavy metals, are here. Radiation levels in some areas exceed safety standards, and erosion from rainfall spreads the contamination downstream. One of the most serious risks, though, comes from landslides. The steep terrain around Mailu Su is prone to slope failure, and several tailings dumps are perched on the rivers and above the villages. In 1958, a landslide dumped thousands of cubic meters of radioactive waste into the river, spreading contamination downstream. International agencies like the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have invested in stabilizing some of the most dangerous sites, but many risks remain. For residents, the abandoned mines and piles are a constant reminder of their radioactive past. Economic hardship has compounded the problem too, as many abandoned facilities remain unsecured and scavengers sometimes collect scrap metal from the contaminated sites. Today, Mailu Su is partially inhabited, but it's still scarred by the radioactive heritage. Large areas of land remain unused, effectively abandoned because of the contamination, and international assistance has helped to reduce the most immediate risks, but the long-lived nature of uranium decay products means that the problem will persist for centuries. Number 2. Papoose Lake and the Nevada Area 51 Nuclear Legacy. So while Area 51 is most often associated with secrecy and the UFO folklore, less attention is given to its genuine radioactive legacy. Situated next to Nevada National Security Site, formerly the Nevada Test Range, Area 51 and the surrounding desert, including Papoose Lake and Groom Lake, were deeply affected by decades of nuclear testing during the Cold War. Though Area 51 itself was primarily used for aircraft research, the broader testing grounds left behind contaminated soils and exclusion areas where radiation persists. From 1951 to 1992, the Nevada test site hosted 928 nuclear detonations. Many of these were atmospheric in the early years, which sent radioactive fallout. Later, underground testing left behind craters, collapsed tunnels, and contaminated aquifers. Papoose Lake, a dry lakebed south of Groom Lake, was never directly bombed, but the area around it absorbed fallout and shock from all nearby detonations. When testing ended in '92, numerous bunkers, tunnels, and facilities were sealed or abandoned, and radiation still lingers in underground areas. Some of those test cavities created by explosions, collapsing massive rock chambers, they're way too unstable and radioactive for reuse, which makes them permanently abandoned. The abandoned structures, too, in that part of Nevada, including the mock towns built to study how buildings would survive a nuclear blast, and many were destroyed or heavily damaged by the testing, while others were simply deserted once the program ended. And today, large areas around Papoose Lake and Groom Lake remain closed to the public, not only for secrecy, but because of the lingering contamination. The Nevada desert is thus scarred not by just mythology, but by genuine radioactive waste. Abandoned bunkers and restricted exclusion zones around Area 51 form a radioactive legacy, every bit as real as its reputation for secrecy. Number 1. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, Northern Ukraine. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, encompassing the abandoned city of Pripyat and surrounding towns and villages in northern Ukraine, remains the most infamous radioactive landscape in the world. Unlike other sites created through controlled testing or managed waste disposal, Chernobyl was the result of a catastrophic accident in April of 1986. Today, nearly 4 decades later, the zone is an immense abandoned area where time seems frozen, radiation still lingers, and nature has reclaimed much of what people left behind. The disaster began in the early hours of April 26, 1986, at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. During a late-night safety test, a series of errors combined with design flaws triggered a sudden surge of power. This caused a massive steam explosion, blowing the roof off the reactor and exposing the reactor core to the atmosphere. The explosion released huge amounts of isotopes like iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90, contaminating much of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and parts of Europe. Pripyat, which was a purpose-built city for the plant's workers and their families, was located just 3 kilometers away. Home to nearly 50,000 people, it was a model Soviet city with modern apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, and shops. Evacuation orders didn't come until the afternoon of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion. When they finally arrived, buses lined the streets and residents were told they would be gone for only a few days. Most left with just a suitcase or a few belongings, leaving behind homes, clothes, furniture, and personal items. They never returned, and within a short time, Pripyat and dozens of surrounding villages were empty. The Soviet authorities quickly established the Chernobyl exclusion zone, initially a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, and later expanded in some areas to account for the contamination patterns. Entire areas were uprooted and relocated, creating ghost towns where everyday life had once flourished. Over 100,000 people were permanently displaced. To contain the destroyed reactor, engineers had to construct a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus. Built quickly in 1986, it was designed to encase the remains of Reactor 4 and prevent further release of radioactive material. Over time, the structure deteriorated, and in 2016 it was covered by an even larger steel structure called the New Safe Confinement, designed to last at least a century. Inside, the wreckage of the reactor and thousands of tons of radioactive debris remain. But radioactive levels in the exclusion zone have decreased significantly since 1986, both through radioactive decay and natural weathering. In many areas, radiation levels are low enough for short-term visits, and tourism has developed under controlled conditions. Visitors are carefully monitored, restricted to certain paths, and required to follow strict safety rules. Yet radiation hotspots still remain, where contamination in soil or debris is still dangerously high. For the communities displaced, though, the abandonment was deeply personal. Entire towns like Kopachi, once just a short distance from the reactor, were bulldozed and buried to reduce the contamination, leaving only a scattering of markers where homes once stood. Residents were relocated into new settlements, but many really never fully adjusted, mourning the loss of their homes, farms, and communities. Some elderly residents, known as the self-settlers, eventually returned illegally to their villages within the zone, preferring to live out their lives in familiar surroundings despite the risk. Chernobyl is unique among the abandoned radioactive places for the scale of the disruption. While other sites like Hanford or Mayak involved contamination in relatively isolated industrial zones, Chernobyl forced the abandonment of entire communities with tens of thousands of people. Unlike test ranges or waste dumps, it wasn't planned. It was a sudden disaster that left cities frozen in time. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is both a monument and a warning. It's a monument to the workers and communities uprooted by the disaster, and to the engineers who risked their lives to contain it. It's a warning, too, of the dangers inherent in complex technology, especially when safety is compromised. Nearly 4 decades on, the zone is one of the most powerful reminders of the nuclear age. It's not just an abandoned place, it's an abandoned world, a city, villages, and farmlands left behind in haste. Pripyat and the surrounding zone stand as the world's most iconic radioactive wasteland, ensuring that Chernobyl's name will remain etched into global memory for centuries.